R. Theodore W. Goldin of Janesville, Wisconsin, a former soldier in the 7th Cavalry and currently the chairman of the Republican State Central Committee of Wisconsin, holds the rare distinction of being among the last individuals, perhaps even the final one, to see General Custer alive. Goldin has recorded his first-hand account of that pivotal day, and his story remains one of the most compelling additions to this compilation. His description of Lieutenant Hodgson's death is remarkably vivid, portraying the intensity of a man who, refusing to retreat further, turned to confront his adversaries with steadfast determination. Hodgson stood firm, revolver in hand, facing his enemies directly, a striking image of courage that leaves a profound impression. Goldin's account challenges some common perceptions surrounding the battle. He disputes the popular belief, one that even Colonel Godfrey and others have endorsed, that Major Reno threw away his pistols during a supposed charge. On August 11, 1904, I sat down to write a letter in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, addressing the inquiries I had received on July 28 and August 2. As I gathered my thoughts, I realized the letters were asking me to share my personal experiences and memories of General Custer and his last battle. Looking back, I understood that the years since that significant event had somewhat clouded my recollections. The years that have elapsed since that stirring event may have somewhat dimmed my recollections. I reflected, recognizing how time could blur even the most vivid memories. With my current responsibilities pressing on me, I knew that what I could share would inevitably be somewhat fragmented. Still, I felt compelled to respond, especially after reading your articles on the subject. Your articles on this subject, as well as the entire series, have been read with great interest. I wrote, feeling a sense of gratitude that such important history would soon be published in book form. In my reply, I shared my connection with General Custer, noting, I had known General Custer from the time I joined the regiment in 1873 up to the time of his tragic death. It was a deep-seated relationship formed through countless campaigns together, except for the year 1875 when my troop was stationed in the South. As I penned these words, memories of our time together surged within me, adventures shared, challenges faced, and the camaraderie that bound us all. Each recollection was a reminder of the impact General Custer had on my life, and I hope that my reflections could add a personal touch to the historical narrative. In the early spring of 1876, news arrived that an expedition was forming to confront the Sioux. Word spread quickly that 3 sizable columns would be mobilized for the mission. Just a few weeks later, our orders came through, directing our battalion to move from our station near Shreveport, Louisiana, up to Fort Lincoln in Dakota Territory. When we reached Fort Lincoln, General Custer was still in Washington, tied up before an investigating committee. He only managed to join us just days before our column was set to move out. On his way from Washington, he had been detained briefly in Chicago, held under arrest, adding to the tension that seemed to follow him. Our journey from Fort Lincoln to the Yellowstone was long and grueling, though I'll spare you the details of the march itself. We reached the Yellowstone River near the mouth of Powder River, where we paused for a few days to outfit our pack train. It was decided we would leave our wagon train behind and set up a supply camp. Major Reno had already left us earlier to scout ahead and had planned to rejoin us near the Tongue River by June 17. After making arrangements to leave the wagons, some recruits, and the regimental band behind at the Powder River, we pressed on to the mouth of the Tongue River. It was June 17th, the same day General Crook was engaged in his fierce battle with the Indians on the Rosebud. All day, we watched the horizon, eyeing every dust cloud swirling across the plains, hoping it signaled Major Reno's return. But as evening fell with no sign of him, we broke camp on the morning of June 18th and moved up the valley. Finally, by early afternoon, we rendezvoused with Reno's command. In those days, one could not help but notice that General Custer seemed deeply unsettled. Normally, he was composed, if not downright cheerful, but this time was different. There was a restlessness about him, a simmering unease that none of us could quite understand. It was as though he sensed something none of us could see, an almost tangible apprehension hanging over him, casting an unfamiliar shadow on his otherwise determined spirit. When Reno returned with his report, it was as though he had been reborn. His old vigor and determination radiated in every move as he organized the troops swiftly and efficiently, setting us on the trail toward the Rosebud. There, we knew General Terry, aboard the supply steamer Far West, was already ahead, hoping to join forces with General Gibbon, whose whereabouts were roughly marked somewhere in that direction. We marched long and hard, the night stretching on as we pushed forward. Finally, we reached the banks of the Yellowstone, where we set up camp, confident that if the steamer was downstream, we were certain to cross its path. Early the next morning, we were back in the saddle, pressing on. By early afternoon, the wagon train of General Gibbon's command came into view, moving slowly up the riverbank. Not long after, we caught sight of the far west steaming toward us. Couriers rode out, carrying word that Reno had picked up the trail of a large group of native warriors. By late afternoon, we had settled into camp near the Rosebud's mouth, gathering for a war council where Reno's findings were thoroughly examined and plans began to unfold. Preparations for an aggressive campaign followed the next day. That night, aboard the steamer on the 21st, as I recall, a final council gathered where General Custer received his orders, just as you've heard them. As the council drew to a close, someone raised a question with General Gibbon about his estimated arrival at the mouth of the Little Bighorn River. He responded firmly, not before noon of the 26th. At the conference, it was shared that Custer had been offered the battalion of the 2nd Cavalry along with the artillery brought by steamer, but he turned them down. Custer explained that he trusted his own command completely and felt more confident leaving them alone. He also expressed concern that the artillery might slow down his progress as he approached the enemy. Among the officers and men, there was a growing sense that this decision aligned with Custer's long-standing desire for an independent command, a situation he had often enjoyed over the years. Regardless, his request was ultimately approved. On the afternoon of June 22nd, our forces lined up to review before General Terry and General Gibbon. Soon after, we picked up the trail that Major Reno had pointed out. From that moment until Reno's encounter with the Indian village, we never strayed from that path, except to seek suitable camping sites when needed. We neglected the directive to scout the surrounding area, and no effort was made to send a messenger across to General Gibbon, despite the fact that George Herendeen, a scout, had been assigned to our command specifically for that purpose. Our days were filled with long marches and rapid movement, continuing at this pace until the night of June 24th. Then, we veered off the trail slightly and appeared to settle down for the night, a deliberate tactic to throw the Indians off our trail. We had strict orders to leave our saddles packed and to be ready for a night march. From the moment we left the Rosebud, General Custer seemed transformed, showing a level of restless energy that was unmistakable. His sole focus seemed to be on reaching and engaging the Indians. It's worth noting that the trail we followed was believed by Bloody Knife and some of our Crow Scouts to have been made by a band of around 1,000 to 1,200 Indians. As we later discovered, this group had journeyed from Missouri River agencies and was composed almost entirely of warriors, prepared and determined. Around 11 o'clock, the order came for us to saddle up and fall into line. A sense of urgency rippled through the camp, and we moved quickly, each of us aware that this could be a critical moment. Ahead of us, a scouting party of Crows and Reese had already set out with Lieutenant Varnum and, if I recall right, Lieutenant Hare. They were pressing forward to scout the trail across the divide, trying to locate the Indians before we made our advance. We left our bivouac behind and followed the trail, pushing on with determination. The plan was to cross the divide under cover of darkness and reach the foothills along the Little Bighorn before dawn. But the land was unforgiving, rugged and steep, making the trail difficult to scout. By the time daylight broke, we found ourselves in a narrow ravine at the foot of a tall line of bluffs, uncertain just how far we still were from the river. During the night, rumors circulated that General Custer had joined up with the scouts ahead. Just after dawn, the scouts reportedly informed him that they had spotted the Indian village down in the valley of the Little Bighorn. However, Custer, skeptical as ever, responded that he didn't believe them. Meanwhile, it was becoming clear that our presence hadn't gone unnoticed. A box of ammunition had gone missing during the night, and a small detachment sent back to retrieve it encountered Indians trying to pry it open. Upon investigation, it turned out the box held hardtack rather than ammunition, but this incident had far-reaching consequences. Quartermaster Sergeant Hurst, seeing the Sioux boy who found it, had reacted by killing him, marking the first casualty of the encounter. When this was reported to Custer, he appeared to take it as a sign, firming up his decision to advance without further delay. In the tense moments as our command was divided, Mitch Booyer, a half-Crow interpreter, approached General Custer with a grave warning. "You're going to find more Indians in that valley than your command can handle," Booyer said, his voice low and steady. Custer, however, bristled at the suggestion. "If you're afraid to go, you can stay behind," he retorted sharply. Bouyer's response was calm but resolute. "I'm not afraid to go anywhere you go," he replied, his eyes hard with resolve. "But if we go in there, neither of us is coming out alive." Just before the advance began, Lieutenant McIntosh assigned me to report to General Custer for duty as an orderly. I immediately made my way to him, feeling a surge of anticipation mixed with a sense of duty. General Custer gave me a clear command to ride alongside Lieutenant Cook, our regimental adjutant, and to assist with any tasks he might direct. As we paused briefly, I noticed the men sprawled out on the ground, some already lost in a brief, precious sleep while their horses grazed quietly among the sagebrush. The air was thick with a tense calm, the kind that comes right before action. General Custer called for the advance, announcing that the 1st Company ready in each battalion would take the lead on the line. Within moments, the men were mounting up, shaking off the quiet rest as they readied themselves for the ride ahead. Earlier, orders had been given for Benteen and his battalion to break off to the left, scouting the territory and driving forward any signs of Indians he encountered. Benteen was to report back with anything he found, while Reno's command would follow the main trail. Meanwhile, General Custer took 5 troops and led them to the right, leaving McDougall in charge of the pack train to follow as best as they could. We began the march in accordance with these instructions. The ride was grueling. After about half an hour, the hills and ravines grew so impassable that our column had to shift left. The terrain demanded it, pushing us ever closer to Major Reno's command, which was pushing up the trail as quickly as the rough, unyielding ascent would allow. With every jolt and climb, our focus sharpened. Finally, after a steep, challenging ascent, we reached the top of a ridge. Before us lay a broad plateau, its gentle slopes rolling down toward the foothills near the river, visible in the distance, perhaps 5 or 6 miles away. The scene opened up like the calm before a storm, the vast land awaiting whatever fate would unfold there. As we pushed forward over the ridge, our command could see Reno's unit a fair distance ahead, moving swiftly down the trail. Off to the left, miles away, Colonel Benteen's command was diligently scouting the bluffs, exactly as instructed. We kept to the general direction of Reno's advance, though we trailed somewhat behind and a bit to his right. Those of us close enough to observe Custer could sense his impatience with our seemingly slow progress. Now and then, he would spur his horse forward ahead of the column, only to pull up and wait for us before once again charging forward. Around that time, a large dust cloud appeared in the river valley, moving in our direction, but we could not yet make out what it signaled. Upon noticing it, Custer rode off towards the river, taking only his orderly trumpeter with him. He stopped for a brief moment atop a high peak, where we saw him wave his hat, seemingly as a greeting to someone in the distance, before quickly returning to the head of our column, led by Captain Keogh and Troop I, seasoned warriors with many battles behind them. With his eyes gleaming from the thrill of the moment, Custer rode up to Keogh, his voice filled with eager energy as he said, "Keogh, those Indians are running. If we can keep them at it, we can afford to sacrifice half the horses in the command." Keogh, maintaining an air of calm as if he were on a formal parade, turned in his saddle and glanced back at the line of eager, sun-bronzed, bearded faces behind him. He looked over to Custer and said, "General, we will do all that man and horse can do." Moments later, the bugle sounded the call to charge, our first bugle note since departing the Rosebud, and we surged northward along the river. We attempted 2 or 3 times to find a way down into the valley below, but each effort ended without success. After the 3rd failed attempt, General Custer had a brief, hurried conversation with Captain Cook. Cook quickly pulled out his notepad, scribbled down a few lines, folded the paper, and called for an orderly. I happened to be the first to reach him, and he handed me the order. "Deliver that to Major Reno, remain with him until we can join forces, and then report back to me immediately," he commanded before disappearing into the action. An instant later, the back of the column rushed past me, vanishing into the ravines. I paused briefly to watch, but quickly realized I was alone in hostile territory. Without delay, I made my way toward Reno's command, tracking them by the dust cloud that lingered above their position. Thankfully, I was largely unbothered, though a few long-range shots were fired at me, which only urged me to ride faster and intensified my eagerness to rejoin my comrades. After a 5 or 6 mile ride, I caught up to Reno just as he was dismounting to engage on foot. I handed him my dispatch, though I was unaware of its contents. Reno quickly glanced over it and tucked it into his pocket. Around this time, the re-scouts suddenly panicked and, as we later learned, did not regain their composure until they reached Powder River and the safety of the wagon train. It soon became clear that the native forces were moving past our flank, closing in from behind. We had to turn and try to hold them back until we could get our horses into the timber. In the process, a few horses were shot and a couple scattered. Not long after, we retreated into the timber, where we had more cover and resumed the fight. With the protection of the trees and riverbank, we could mount a stronger defense, at least for a short time. It was not long before we noticed Captain Moylan mounting his troop. Lieutenant Wallace, who was nearby on the skirmish line, called out to Captain French, who commanded the Central Company, asking if he knew the orders. French replied that he had not received any but would try to find out. A few minutes later, he shouted back, saying he believed there was going to be a charge. Though he had not received any official orders, he suggested we should mount up and support them. We were ordered to mount up, and as we prepared, we realized that around 15 of our men were on foot, having whether lost their horses to enemy fire or due to their horses bolting. Lieutenant McIntosh, whose horse was gone, took one from a trooper named McCormick. McCormick handed it over, saying, "We are all dead anyway, and I might as well die dismounted as mounted." Once in the saddle, we rode out of the timber, only to be surprised by the sight before us. Rather than leading a charge on the Indians, Reno was making a swift retreat up the bluffs on the far side of the river. As soon as the Indians spotted this, they closed in on our flanks and unleashed a barrage of gunfire on our retreating ranks. Fortunately, they were not particularly skilled shots while on horseback, and so our casualties remained relatively light during this frantic withdrawal. For a stampede it surely was. There was a report that in his agitation, Reno had fired his revolver wildly at the Indians and then discarded it. I know for a fact this is untrue, as that revolver ended up in the possession of General Benteen or his family, and remained with them at least as of a few years back. As we moved along in our retreat, I was riding on the left side of our column near the trees, with the river almost in view when my horse suddenly stumbled and threw me into a patch of sagebrush. Thankfully, I suffered only a few scrapes. Just as I scrambled to my feet, Lieutenant Wallace came by, yelling for me to run to the trees, as my horse had been killed. I did not take a moment to confirm this. I simply took his advice, barely touching the ground as I dashed for the cover of the timber, which I soon reached. From my hiding place, I watched as our men urged their horses into the river, pushing them across the stream littered with boulders. I saw Lieutenant Hodgson's horse leap into the water, and then him, struggling as though he were injured. He managed to free himself from the stirrups and grab hold of a stirrup strap from a nearby trooper, allowing him to struggle his way to the other side. Once he reached the bank, however, it was clear he was wounded. Yet he held on, and the trooper attempted to pull him up behind him on the saddle, though without stopping his horse. Moments later, Hodgson appeared to be struck again. He lost his grip, fell to the ground, staggered to his feet, and tried to reach another comrade who reined in to help him. Just as it looked like he might be saved, the second trooper threw up his arms, swayed in the saddle, and collapsed heavily to the ground. Hodgson then attempted to head toward the ravine where the command was vanishing, stumbling forward a few steps, struggling to stand, only to fall again. It seemed he realized that further retreat was hopeless. I watched as he turned to face the advancing Indians, drew his revolver, and began firing. Moments later, 3 or 4 shots rang out from my side of the river, and I saw Hodgson stagger, fall, and I knew it was over. Meanwhile, our troops managed to cross the river and advance through a nearby ravine, all except for those who had perished at the ford, one of the most treacherous spots along the river for a considerable distance. Left alone, I began to ponder my own fate, yet I remained unnoticed and unbothered. The native warriors were preoccupied along the riverbanks, stripping and desecrating the bodies of our fallen. Around this time, I heard the echo of heavy gunfire downstream. It seemed clear that Custer was engaged with the native forces, and from brief glimpses of the distant village, I sensed that his situation was as dire as ours. Many of the warriors before us dispersed, urging their ponies forward to join the battle at the far end of the village. At that moment, I spotted the scout Herndon, George Herondine, some distance away, moving toward the river. I called out to him, and we quickly regrouped. He informed me that 15 dismounted men from our unit had reached a wooded area a few hundred yards away, but to get closer to the river, they had to cross an exposed clearing where every attempt was met with hostile fire. Before leaving, the native warriors had set fire to the river bottom, likely to conceal their movements or perhaps to drive out any wounded survivors. Ironically, the smoke shielded us, enabling us to reach the river, ford it with difficulty, and encounter one of our Crow scouts, who guided us toward our main force. Upon arrival, we found that Benteen and his battalion had regrouped there, though no one knew Custer's location. We reported what we had observed and heard. Just then, someone spotted a white flag waving from the river bottom near the place where Herndon and I had taken cover. At great personal risk, Lieutenant Hare crept to a vantage point on the bluffs overlooking the valley. After extensive signaling, he managed to convince the group below that we were allies. They soon crossed the river to join us, revealing themselves to be the dismounted soldiers who had been left behind during Reno's retreat. As we began our retreat, I noticed that Lieutenant McIntosh, who was riding McCormick's horse, was several yards ahead of me. His lariat had somehow come loose and was trailing along the ground, with the picket pin hitting sagebrush and other obstacles, creating a hazardous area around him. Some of the men tried to alert him to the danger, but it appeared he did not hear them. Just moments later, I saw his horse go down. Whether the horse had been shot or not, I could not tell, but as I passed, I saw the lieutenant lying where he had fallen. He seemed either dead or stunned, most likely dead, as we found him in the same spot the next day after the Indians had moved on. While standing on the bluffs, looking down into the valley, I heard raised voices nearby. Turning toward the sound, I heard Captain Weir say, "Well, by God, if you won't go, I will, and if we ever live to get out of here, someone will suffer for this." With that, he strode away. Moments later, I saw D Troop mounting up and moving down the valley toward the distant gunfire. Without any apparent orders, the entire command followed, breaking formation, except for the 2 troops under Benteen and Godfrey. We advanced down the valley until we spotted Weir and his troop retreating from a significantly larger force of Indians. Quickly, we formed a line to hold back the advancing enemy until Weir and his men could fall back behind us. There, they regrouped with support from some of our nearby soldiers, forming a line and opening fire. This allowed us to retreat and reassemble behind them. In this way, we continued falling back gradually. At one point, Colonel Benteen, who appeared to be leading in our section, turned to Lieutenant Wallace and said, "Wallace, there is no use falling back any further. Form your troop. You're right resting here, and we will make a stand." Wallace grinned and replied, "I haven't any troop, only 2 men. Benteen, with a grim laugh, responded, "Form yourself and your 2 there, and I will tell you more about it when I find out myself." Our defensive line began to form with a small group, soon joined by others who took cover with us behind the sagebrush. We hastily piled up dirt for protection and returned fire, keeping the Native American forces at a cautious distance until nightfall provided us some respite. Under cover of darkness, we shifted positions slightly, setting up our corral and hospital, and spent the night fortifying our defenses as best we could. With dawn, the battle resumed and continued without a break until around 3 in the afternoon, when we were surprised to see the Native Americans dismantling their teepees, packing up their travois, and gradually moving up the river valley. It was a vast movement of ponies, travois, and people, fortunately, just out of our rifle range. Twice that afternoon, volunteer parties went to fetch water. Both times, they came under fire, and it was only on the second trip that someone was injured. Poor Madden, from K Troop, took a devastating hit, with his leg shattered in 3 places between the ankle and the knee. We managed to bring him back to the hospital, where they amputated his leg later that night. The next day, Generals Terry and Gibbon arrived, bringing much-needed relief and, for the first time, authentic news about the fate of our comrades in the other battalion. On the 28th, after we transported our wounded across the river, we visited the battleground to bury Custer's men. Of all the bodies on the field, Nearly everyone showed signs of mutilation, but as far as I recall, our fallen leader bore no such marks. I cannot delve deeply into the incidents of the battle or provide detailed descriptions in this limited space, especially as these have already been thoroughly covered in your article. However, over time, I have discussed the battle with numerous Army officers and frontier veterans, and the consensus appears to be that the disaster stemmed from a combination of two, possibly three, main causes. First, the division of the command into 4 distinct columns, each separated by approximately 15 miles from the battlefield, without any clear knowledge of the enemy's exact location or strength. This division meant that, at a critical juncture, none of the columns were within supporting distance of one another. Second, Custer's early arrival, which put him in the enemy's presence almost 24 hours ahead of schedule. Third, the loss of horses, which included much of Custer's surplus ammunition. This topic has been widely analyzed by those more capable than myself, so I will refrain from adding further here. My experiences with General Custer always left me with the impression that he was boldly brave, often willing to take risks without fully weighing the odds. I have often thought that his decisions in the face of his orders might have been influenced by his deep feelings of apparent disgrace over his treatment by the president. Perhaps he sought to redeem himself with a bold, decisive victory, similar to his triumph at the Washita, to restore his reputation as a fearless leader and accomplished Indian fighter. Whatever the reasons, we must acknowledge that he fought a valiant battle, ultimately sacrificing his life alongside comrades who had shared his victories in countless battles before.